My name is Zoe. I'm standing in my kitchen, looking at my phone with a text from my mother that reads, "The mortgage is due." It's like a punch in the gut, bringing back a whirlwind of emotions and memories that have been brewing for years. I've been the reliable one in my family for as long as I can remember. I run a small accounting firm in a cozy office in the heart of the city, about an hour's drive from the small town where I grew up. Over the past 8 years, I've made 96 mortgage payments on my parents' house, not to mention covering various other expenses like property taxes, home repairs, and even my younger brother Jake's rent on more than one occasion. My parents, Henry and Mildred, live in a charming 2-story house on the outskirts of town. It sits on a beautiful plot of land, about 5 acres, with a large garden that my father takes great pride in. My mother has always been a homemaker, and my father worked at the local factory until he had to retire early due to a back injury. My brother Jake, on the other hand, has always been the free spirit of the family. He's in his late 20s and has had a string of short-lived jobs. He's currently living with his girlfriend, Lily, in an apartment not too far from our parents' place. It all started 8 years ago when I was in my late 20s. My parents were in a financial bind. They had refinanced their house twice during the good years, pulling out cash each time, but then the mortgage payments ballooned, and their savings couldn't keep up. One Tuesday evening, I got a panicked call from my mother. The bank had sent a foreclosure notice, and she was beside herself. I drove to their house that night. We sat at the kitchen table, the foreclosure letter between us like a dark cloud. The only way to save the house was to refinance again, but the bank wouldn't lend to 2 retirees with no income and a poor credit score. They needed someone with a stable business and good credit, and that someone was me. The closing attorney was a smart man. He wouldn't let me put my savings and credit on the line without proper protection. So, that afternoon, my parents signed a new deed, giving me the majority share of the house in exchange for the money I brought to clear the arrears and the loan I took out in my name. I became the primary borrower and the majority owner of the house that day. My father dismissed it as just paperwork, and my mother called it a blessing. I saw it as a way to keep a roof over my parents' heads. I put the closing folder in a fireproof box, a habit I've always had as an accountant. Little did I know how important that folder would become. After that, the monthly mortgage payment of $1,200 became my responsibility. I set up an auto pay from my business account, and for 8 years, it was like clockwork. I also covered the property tax, replaced the old furnace in the 3rd year, and fixed the roof in the 6th year. I never made a big deal out of it, I just did what I thought a daughter should do. But as time went on, I started to notice a pattern. Every family dinner was filled with talk about Jake. He was finding himself, according to my father. He'd quit a few jobs, and my parents always made excuses for him. When Jake needed help with rent, they'd ask me, and I'd send the money. Somehow, it became a loan to my parents instead of a gift to Jake. I tried to bring it up gently during holidays. Maybe Jake could contribute a little, or we could split the costs. But my mother would get a hurt look on her face and change the subject to the food, and my father would say, "Family doesn't keep score." I let it go because I didn't want to start a fight, and I knew walking away would mean ruining my credit and losing my parents' home. Then, one spring, my father had a heart attack. It happened on a Sunday while he was working in the garden. My mother called me before she called the ambulance, which showed me where I stood in the family's pecking order. I drove the hour to the hospital in 45 minutes. He pulled through, but it was a wake-up call. After his recovery, my parents decided it was time to make a proper will with a real lawyer. My mother gave me a box full of documents to organize. One night, while sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, I found their will at the bottom of the box. The envelope wasn't even sealed. I told myself not to read it, but I couldn't help it. I read it line by line, looking for my name. It wasn't there. The house, the land, the savings account I'd helped rebuild, everything was to be inherited by Jake. There was a single sentence about me, saying that I'd been provided for during their lifetime and wouldn't share in the estate. I sat there in shock. I'd made 96 mortgage payments, and this was how they repaid me? I read the will again to make sure I hadn't misread it. I hadn't. The will had been drawn up while I was taking care of my father, making sure he took his medications on time and dealing with the insurance company. The next week, I went to Sunday dinner as usual. My mother made her famous roast beef. Jake and Lily were there. The conversation turned to the future of the house. Jake said he and Lily were thinking of moving in to help my parents now that my father's health was a concern. My mother lit up, and my father said it made sense to keep the house in the family. I asked calmly what he meant by family. He didn't even look up from his plate and said, "The home goes to the son. That's how it's always been done." My mother nodded in agreement. It was like a knife in my heart. I'd been paying for that house for 8 years, and they were just going to give it to Jake. That night, I sat in my living room and made a spreadsheet. I listed all the payments I'd made over the 8 years, the mortgage, the taxes, the repairs. The total was over $150,000. Then I listed what I'd been promised in return, and the column was empty. I'm not a dramatic person. I didn't want to have a big argument with my parents. I knew they'd just see me as ungrateful. So, I did the one thing I could do. I opened my banking app and turned off the auto pay for the mortgage. The first few days were hard. I was used to taking care of everything, and it felt strange not to make that payment. But I held my ground. The mortgage was due on the 1st of the month, and when the lender's app sent me a notice that the payment was past due, I just let it sit. I told myself this wasn't an emergency I'd created, it was a bill that should have been shared all along. By the 8th, I still hadn't heard from my parents. Either they hadn't noticed or they were waiting for me to fix it. I knew it was the latter. I'd been the one to notice everything for the family for so long. On the 11th, my mother called. No hello, just, the bank called about a late payment. There must be a mistake with your account. I told her there was no mistake, that I'd stopped the auto pay. There was a long pause on the line, and then she started to cry. She said she didn't understand, that we were a family and family takes care of each other. I asked her gently if the will took care of the family, too. She quickly recovered and said the will was my father's business and had nothing to do with the mortgage. She also said that families don't keep ledgers. I almost laughed because that's exactly what I do for a living. Jake got involved on the 12th. He texted me first, then called when I didn't respond. His voice was full of confidence, like he'd never worried about money in his life. He said my mother was a mess and that I was causing stress for my father's heart. I told him I was well aware of my father's heart, having been the one to take care of him after his heart attack. He then tried to make himself look like the bigger person, saying that money wasn't everything and that he was the one who actually spent time with our parents. I asked him if money wasn't everything, would he like to start covering the mortgage on the house he was about to inherit? He laughed and said I was being dramatic. Lily took a different approach. A few months ago, she'd added me to a shared board on a home renovation app. I thought it was just a friendly gesture, but now I realized it was a sign of their plans. The board was called The Dream Home, and it was full of pictures of a renovated version of my parents' house, new kitchen, new bathrooms, the works. They were planning to remodel the house on the assumption that I'd keep paying the mortgage. It was like a cold bucket of water over my head. I realized they didn't see me as a daughter, they saw me as a bank. By the 3rd week, my mother had taken the story public. She started calling our relatives, telling them I was breaking her heart. My Aunt Rose called to scold me, and a cousin I hadn't talked to in years texted to say I was being heartless. My mother also posted in the town's community group. She wrote a sad paragraph about how hard it is to get old and how she'd raised her children, hoping they'd be there for her. The comments were full of people offering support and criticizing me. My cousin Sarah was the only one who called to hear my side. She listened to everything, the 8 years of payments, the will, and the renovation plans. She said, "You're not the bad guy here. You just stopped paying for a role you were forced to play." Then, one Thursday night, I was accidentally added to a group text. The group was called Parents' House Plans, and it had my mother, father, Jake, and Lily in it. For about a minute, I read their messages. Lily had written that the contractor could start in the spring if the financing held. My mother had written that I'd come around, that I always did. Jake had written that I'd cave by Christmas. My father had written the line that broke me, "Once the house is Jake's, this stops being her problem." They saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. I took a screenshot of all the messages. That screenshot led me to the fireproof box. I pulled out the closing folder and spread the documents on my kitchen table. I read the deed carefully, and there it was, my name as the majority owner. I'd been the majority owner of the house for 8 years, and they'd forgotten. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own, so I called a real estate attorney, Ms. Thompson, who I'd done accounting work for in the past. I brought her the deed, the settlement statement, and 8 years of mortgage records. She looked over the documents and told me that as the majority owner, my father could only leave Jake his share of the house, not mine. She also said that my parents couldn't sell, refinance, or remodel the house without my written consent. She gave me 3 options. I could force a sale and take my share, I could buy out their portion at fair market value, or I could keep being the owner and let them realize the house wasn't theirs to give away. I thanked her and paid her invoice. Then I went home to wait. A month after I turned off the auto pay, my mother sent that text. I stared at it for a long time, thinking about all the years of payments, the will, and the group text. I replied simply, "Everything goes to Jake. So does the mortgage." My phone started buzzing immediately. My mother was angry, Jake was accusing me of hurting my father, and Lily was saying I was tearing the family apart. I texted my mother back, saying we should all sit down and talk. I also called Ms. Thompson and told her I was ready. My father called me that evening. He asked about my business, which surprised me because he hadn't asked in years. Then he said he didn't understand why I was doing this to them. He talked about how a man works his whole life to leave something for his family. He then said, "The home goes to the son. That's how it's always been done." I told him I loved him, but I also said we needed to have an adult conversation. He thought I was coming to apologize, but I had other plans. My mother organized a family dinner for Sunday. I found out through Sarah that she'd invited several relatives to be there. They were trying to pressure me into backing down. I spent Saturday night getting my documents in order. I made 3 copies of the deed, the settlement statement, and the mortgage records. I also printed Ms. Thompson's letter confirming my ownership. On Sunday morning, before I left for the dinner, I checked the renovation app. Lily had added a new item, a contractor's estimate for $50,000 for the renovations. The note said Jake had told her my mother could cover the deposit from the savings account. The savings account I'd helped build up. That was the final straw. I screenshotted the estimate and added it to my folder. I was no longer hesitant. I knew I was doing the right thing. I drove to my parents' house. When I arrived, there were several cars in the driveway. The house smelled like my mother's roast beef. The dining room table was set for a big meal, and everyone was there, my parents, Jake, Lily, Aunt Rose, and a few other relatives. My mother started the conversation. She gave a prepared speech about ungrateful children and aging parents. Jake then stood up and said I was cutting off my own father over money. He asked, "Would you really put your parents out on the street over a grudge?" I didn't raise my voice. I calmly said that no one was putting anyone on the street and that it was Jake who had used those words. Then I took out the folders and distributed them around the table. I explained that 8 years ago, I'd refinanced the house in my name to save it from foreclosure. I'd been the primary borrower ever since, and I was the majority owner of the house. I told them that a will could only give away what a person actually owned, and my father couldn't leave Jake my share of the house. The room went silent. Jake exploded, saying the papers were a trick. Lily's face turned white as she realized her dream renovation was in jeopardy. My mother started crying, saying I'd tricked them. But Aunt Rose, who had been reading the folder, said, "Henry, Mildred, this is real. It's recorded." That statement hit them hard. My father sat there in silence, looking at the deed. His face went from confident to afraid. He'd built his whole belief around the idea that the home goes to the son, and now he was looking at a piece of paper that said otherwise. When the room quieted down, I said I hadn't come to take anyone's home. I just wanted the truth to be known. I offered them the 3 options Ms. Thompson had given me. My mother said I was treating the family like a business transaction. I gently reminded her that she'd said families don't keep ledgers, but the bank does, and my name was on the mortgage. I stood up and said I was done. I left a signed copy of Ms. Thompson's letter on the table and told them to let me know which option they chose. They took 3 weeks to decide. In the end, they chose the first option. My parents would stay in the house, and we'd sign an agreement splitting the costs fairly. Jake refused to contribute and moved out within a month. Lily's renovation plans died, and the community group stopped criticizing me after Sarah posted the facts. Now, I still visit my parents, but it's different. We talk about the weather and my father's health, and we rarely mention money. I've learned that love shouldn't be one-sided, and it's okay to set boundaries. I sleep better at night, and the auto pay remains off. This is my story, a story of standing up for myself and finding justice in the end.